Good evening. My name is Heather Borowski, and on behalf of the Vanderbilt Speakers Committee, I would like to welcome all of you to Impact Symposium 2010, The Future of Capitalism. This year's symposium focuses on the economic crisis that has engulfed our society, one which is forcing us to reevaluate the very core of economic freedoms we have come to expect as American citizens. In order to delve deeper into this broad topic, we are proud to present two stimulating nights of conversation. Tonight, we will be discussing business or the consumer first with honored guests Mr. Ralph Nader and Mr. John Stossel. Tomorrow evening, we will explore the greater implications of free markets and capitalism with Governor Mitt Romney. In an effort to bring tonight's discussion to greater understanding, the committee has recruited our own Dr. Vanessa Beasley, who will be moderating the point-counterpoint conversation that will follow our speakers' keynotes. Dr. Beasley, a Vanderbilt alumni herself, is currently serving as an associate professor of communication studies at Vanderbilt. She's written several books, including You the People, American National Identity in Presidential Rhetoric, as well as Who Belongs in America, Presidents, Rhetoric, and Immigration. Her work has also been published in a variety of journals, including Political Communication, Quarterly Journals of Speech, and Communication Monographs, among many others. We chose Dr. Beasley because of her extensive knowledge in political communications and are deeply honored to have her joining us this evening. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Vanessa Beasley.
Good evening. My first duty as moderator tonight is to tell you the plan for the evening. Here's what tonight's going to look like. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Ralph Nader, and he'll speak for about 20-25 minutes. I'll come back and introduce our second speaker, Mr. John Stossel, and he'll also speak for 20 or 25 minutes. When they're both finished, we'll begin a conversation, first by asking a few questions that have been generated by the Student Speakers Committee, and then, time permitting, we'll take questions from the floor. Before I introduce Mr. Nader, I'd also like to tell you a little bit about the history of Impact. The Vanderbilt University's Impact Symposium began in 1964 when 11 speakers were invited to campus to give their perspective on the topic of the South in transition. The symposium was started by Chancellor Alexander Hurd with the goal of increasing political awareness among members of the Vanderbilt University and Nashville communities. Even in its early years, Impact often received widespread attention. In 1967, for example, activist Stokely Carmichael was invited to speak at the Impact Symposium. Many members of the university's Board of Trust at the time were outspoken in their opposition to this speech. With Chancellor Hurd's support, members of the Impact Committee chose to actively demonstrate their commitment to the public discussion of controversy by welcoming Mr. Carmichael to campus. The year later, in 1968, Bobby Kennedy spoke in Memorial Gymnasium to Impact's largest crowd ever, 16,000 audience members. Over the past decade, control over Impact has shifted from a committee solely responsible for this event to a group focused on bringing speakers to the campus throughout the year. Today, a student committee called the Speakers Committee maintains sole responsibility for choosing the themes and speakers for Impact. This year, that committee chose as its theme, the future of capitalism. With the economic struggles our country is currently facing, such a theme could not be more timely. Tonight, Ralph Nader and John Stossel will seek to provide insights to questions of consumer protection and governmental oversight. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Nader. Ralph Nader is a political activist, consumer advocate, and four-time presidential candidate. Honored by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century, Mr. Nader has spearheaded sweeping change in protecting the health, safety, and democracy of everyday citizens. First and foremost an advocate, Mr. Nader began his extraordinary 30-year legacy with his battle against the auto industry, which resulted in life-saving motor vehicle safety legislation. Once he was firmly established at the forefront of the consumer movement, he continued to fight in government and public opinion for consumer rights. Mr. Nader helped create, for example, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Due to Mr. Nader, we now have safer drinking water, cleaner air, and more freedom of information. Among Mr. Nader's other victories are ideas we now take for granted: seatbelts, airbags, crash-worthy cars, better labeling on food, lower levels of lead in the environment, and healthier eating habits. Mr. Nader organized the Green Party's first presidential campaign and helped perpetuate a robust, progressive political movement within a network of activists and leaders. With his simple yet profound credo, Nader strongly affirms that there can be no daily democracy without daily citizenship. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Ralph Nader.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Beasley. Thank you all for coming. The subject today is rather broad. As you know from the program, it's the future of capitalism, business or consumer first. And of course, it behooves us to ask, what is this thing called capitalism? I remember once when I was a child and we were having a discussion around the table, my father asked us, why will capitalism always survive? We provided a number of answers which didn't satisfy him until we heard his response, which is, he said, capitalism will always survive because socialism will always be around to save it. And of course, with the Wall Street bailout, that is an expression of that constant circularity when the taxpayer and the government, in a whole bewildering, often variety of ways, through the tax system, through subsidies, handouts, giveaways, straight out bailouts, and inflated contracts, et cetera, bail out industries or companies that are large enough to have the political power to demand it. What's interesting is that he could have asked, well, what can result in capitalism not surviving? And in retrospect, I would have answered, the corporate destruction of capitalism is what will prevent capitalism from surviving. Large corporations do not obey capitalist principles. The principal capitalists left in this country are family-owned small businesses. Capitalist principles are, one, if you can't make it in the marketplace, you sink. Corporations now of a certain size don't go bankrupt, they go to Washington. Or if they go bankrupt, they're just merged into larger corporations like Bank of America and JP Morgan that are in turn bailed out. The second principle of capitalism is that if you own the company, you should have some measure of control. When large shareholder-owned corporations on the stock exchange are underway, the shareholders don't they don't control what they own. The shareholders have been over the years stripped of any reasonable authority, even to determine basic policy, often mergers. They're not asked for approval, bankruptcy decisions, and of course executive compensation. So that's the second principle giant corporations violate of capitalism. The third, and there are many, I'll just go to the third, is that large corporations can use political power in state and national capitals to crush small business competitors. They can either do it through manipulation of the tax system, they can do it through predatory practices, they can do it through monopolistic impacts, they can do it by developing certain regulations that small companies cannot adhere to. There's a whole variety of ways, and they're not reluctant to use it. So what do we have if we don't have capitalism meeting these kinds of standards? We have the corporate state, or we have state capitalism, or we have corporate socialism, pick your phrase. And that means that corporations do have a tremendous drive to control all potential opposition to them. And government, of course, is a principal source of opposition. And so through political campaign contributions, through putting corporate executives in high government positions like Department of Defense, Treasury, and other departments, by developing a lobbying corps in Washington that can lead us to the following conclusion, that there's not a single agency or department in Washington that is not overwhelmingly controlled by outside corporate power with their inside allies, including OSHA, unfortunately, and the Department of Labor. Therefore, when you hear people that aren't quite up to par with what's going on in the evolution of the corporate state attack government, you should ask them, what's the adjective? It's the corporate government. They don't want to admit that. There's a difference between a conservative and a corporatist, and that's one of them. The corporate government in Washington is what Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address when he warned us of the military-industrial complex. The corporate government in Washington is when Citibank Robert Rubin can go on a weekend and meet with Chairman of the Federal Reserve Bernanke and the Treasury Secretary Paulson and cut a deal without any congressional knowledge or involvement, and cut a deal that obligated the U.S. taxpayer to buy $45 billion in preferred stock and to guarantee $360 billion of Citigroup's bad notes. Imagine that. In secret, on a weekend, no congressional hearing, no involvement, no legislation, just a Monday morning press release based on, well, we have to do it because it could have brought down the whole economy. Too big to fail. Now, the thrust for control often blurs the traditional ideologies of liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, etc. The problem with these ideologies, and they possess a lot of us, don't they, is that the moment you commit to any one of those ideologies, you eliminate a whole swath of reality that doesn't fit. You'll notice the Downing Street memos when the British came with Bush's people before the invasion of Iraq, they went back and they wrote a memo that said, it looks like the Bush people are fixing the facts to the policy. In other words, they had already decided what they were going to do, and they were going to fix the facts, which were lies and falsehoods like weapons of mass destruction, to the policy. I always thought the ancient Roman dicta was very tutorial for us. Out of the fact comes the law. That's what allows you to continually go deep into the reality of the situation. We should also remember that the mercantile interest representing commercial values, if it is not subordinated to civic values, is going to decay any type of democratic process, whether procedurally or substantively or electorally. And what we have allowed in this country is an increasing subjugation of civic values, such as access to justice, voter choice, access to the marketplace in an informed way, health, safety, respect for environment, and posterity. We've allowed civic values to be subordinated to commercial supremacy. And that is the source of a lot of our problems. You know, every major religion, going back thousands of years, warned its adherents not to give too much power to the merchant class, to the money changers, not to give too much power to that part of society that has a singular monomaniacal determination to aggregate profits and personal materialism. And why did they all come to the same conclusion? You think it was revelation? I think it was probably daily experience. Even Adam Smith warned a great deal about the excesses of commercial interests and said when business people get together around the table, watch out. They're probably conspiring against the general interest. Even Frederick Hayek, who was the guru of the free market in his book, The Road to Serfdom, was incredibly articulate about the excessive power of giant multinational corporations. And that was before World War II. So we've had adequate notice about these matters. Adam Smith once said, the end of all production is consumption. And so consumers have to be first. Business exists to serve consumers, not consumers exist to serve the short-range priorities of business policies. Serving consumers means that the consumer value itself, whether it's health, safety, fairness in the marketplace, access to competitive products and services, the ability to address grievances in courts of law, etc., must take supremacy over commercial interests. That's how you get the best out of commercial interests. They tend to adjust to that kind of reality when they can't destroy it. And so my experience started, my father was a small businessman. He ran a restaurant and a bakery and a delicatessen. And I got a good dose of what happens when large business, large chain stores, take unfair advantage in small businesses, even though small businesses were doing very well in terms of giving people credit during the Depression, which the AMP, for example, would not do. They would continue to give to local charity, which the AMP said they wouldn't do because they give at central headquarters, et cetera, and et cetera. It also occurred to me after a while that I was losing a lot of my friends on the highway in crashes. High school, college, law school. It was really quite a bloodbath. That was the time when there was probably three to four times more deaths and serious injuries on the highway than there are today. And I looked at the data, and I found two striking characteristics. And one was that there is this almost perfect predictability of 50, 55,000, 48,000 people dead a year, hundreds of thousands injured, and the predictability that their casualties and their crashes were all due to driver error. It was always not behind the wheel. It was never the motor vehicle engineering design, operationally crash-worthy. It was never the highway design. The powers that be wanted to blame the driver, because if the spotlight extended beyond the driver, who obviously is a factor, then the people would say, well, why don't we get defective cars recalled? And why don't we have engineering systems like airbags and seat belts and padded dash panels and collapsing steering columns and head restraints and rollover bars, et cetera, in cars. So there was an ideology of traffic safety that serviced the technological stagnation of the auto industry itself. I got really angry. I got upset. I lost friends. And when I learned that they could have been saved in motor vehicle crashes, as your friends are saved today, I pushed for federal regulation of the motor vehicle industry. And irregularly enforced, depending on the power of the auto company lobbyists and who was in office at the time. Over 1 million people were saved through a tripartite federal policy of highway driver and motor vehicle safety. Over 1 million lives saved and tens of millions of injuries prevented or diminished in severity, because basically the pressure was on the auto companies to let their engineers do their job and not simply let the stylists engage in their wares at the expense of the engineers. And it went from cars to food safety. 7,000 to 8,000 people die every year from contaminated food. 70 million are sickened every year from contaminated food. It went to forms of energy. I was working on forms of energy. The oil companies and gas and coal companies had pretty much their sway in Washington. The nuclear power industry emerged with massive protections against liability and massive guarantees, free research and development, all kinds of protections. That renewable energy was not afforded, or even energy conservation was not afforded. Pharmaceuticals, we started the health research group with Dr. Sidney Wolfe, and at the time over 100,000 people died from predictable and preventable side effects of prescription drugs. There were hundreds of over-the-counter drugs that were sold that were not effective for the purposes for which they were advertised. We got most of them off the market with the help of, obviously, the Food and Drug Administration. Air and water pollution I looked on as compulsory consumption, a form of latent corporate coercion. You can't really not inhale. I've met some anti-regulatory people who seem to be left with that option. But you can't effectively resist this, because you can't see what's in the air and what's in the food that's contaminated or what's in the water. Medical malpractice, the Harvard School of Public Health estimates At least 100,000 people die every year in hospitals outside of emergency rooms because of hospital medical errors. That's a lot of people. 100,000 a year. That's double, more than double the number who die on the highway. 58,000 people, according to OSHA, every year die from workplace-related disease and trauma. The EPA estimates 65,000 die from air pollution, rather horrible forms of death, asphyxiation, etc. The latest study, peer-reviewed in the Journal of Public Health by Harvard medical researchers, just about 45,000 Americans die a year because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosis and treatment in time. Now, how long do we let this go on? How long do we let this go on? While we sharpen our deregulatory ideologies, while we talk about laissez-faire, while we talk about a free market that isn't there, while we talk about self-reliance, as if we have X-ray vision, as if we have all the time in the world to deal with very complex technologies that have, if not immediate, long-range cumulative forms of violence that are inflicted on us against our will. How long do we let this go on? The health insurance bill was just passed. It goes into effect in terms of 95% of its coverage starting in 2014. That's 180,000 Americans who are going to die, 45 a year, because they can't afford health insurance to get treatment and diagnosis. Yesterday in Jacksonville, Alabama, 2 people came up to me and gave me detailed descriptions of their siblings who couldn't afford health care, and they died in their 30s and their 40s. So, you know, George Will once was sitting in his study at home in Washington, D.C., and he heard a huge crash. And then he rushed out, and a woman lay dead on the highway. And as you know, he's a conservative columnist. And he went back and he typed out a column, and he used the phrase, "Enough of the pitiless abstractions. Let's get down to the empirical reality here. Let's see if our sense of values can be provoked not by some abstract theory, by people who have health insurance, by people who do use the courts, but don't want other people to have health insurance, but don't want other people to use the courts unless it's their design, and have the grim reality on the ground provoke our sense of values and our sense of forward redirection." The way the government has been asked, our government writ large, to deal with corporate misbehavior, corporate negligence, and corporate predation is one, regulation. And we know OSHA and NHTSA and FDA and FAA, et cetera. And that's the first visit that the corporate lobbyists make in Washington. They have to take control of those regulatory agencies. And the citizen groups on the other side, vastly outnumbered, are trying to get the regulatory agencies to enforce the law. I remember after the Cuban hijacks in the early 70s to Havana, I and others asked the Federal Administration Agency to require tougher cockpit doors and latches for all passenger aircraft. And the FAA was a prisoner of the airline industry and the aircraft industry, and the latter two said no. And the airline industry didn't want to pay $3,000 an airline to make it impossible for passengers who want to bring a plane down to break through the cockpit door. And they said no, 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 until 9/11. After 9/11, they finally got around to it. That's what happens when you have deregulation. That's what happens when you have the absence of the federal cop on the corporate crime, fraud, and abuse beat. So we look at the second approach to controlling corporate excesses or misbehavior, and that is competition. And that sometimes works. Volvo put 3-point seat belts in their cars, and long before the auto companies in Detroit, and we used that to push General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler to do that. The head of Allstate was a big champion of airbags, even though he took a lot of heat from the auto companies back in the early 70s. Sometimes it works, but it has its limitations because it's often a conforming practice through trade associations, often called collusion. The third approach is litigation. This really upsets these corporate lawyers and their and their clients. It's like it's okay for corporations to have full sway to use the courts, but not wrongfully injured people. Heaven forbid that anything more than 6% of wrongfully injured people are able to file a claim or able to persist against the corporate law firms who can wear down the plaintiff's lawyer by delaying, because they get paid by the hour and the plaintiff's lawyer only gets a contingent fee. The fourth area is shareholder action. Once in a while, often through religious orders, shareholders have asked for resolutions. They've put pressure. Very, very modest achievements there because shareholders really don't have much authority. They're just the owners, and they don't control very much. And the SEC hasn't helped very much in that respect as well. Another way of controlling them can be considered cooperatives. And that's unfortunate. In Europe, Western Europe, cooperatives really have much more influence. In fact, there was a time in Switzerland when two food co-ops controlled over 30% of the food retail business. But I always hold out the possibility that a new model of economic activity, co-ops owned by the consumers, can do a better countervailing effect. But we're open to all kinds of imaginative ways. Now, if consumers were more informed, yes, they could avoid some of the easy trapdoors in buying insurance and shopping for credit, etc. And it would be a good idea if the universities and the high schools in this country, instead of wasting so much time for the students, that they taught them about the economic systems by showing how they can be more skilled consumers and more demanding taxpayers for government services properly delivered, or more civic skills in terms of negotiating the democratic processes and making democracy work to hold powerful institutions more accountable and to displace them with more grassroots community institutions. We should all think about why higher education as well as secondary schools don't have those kinds of courses. It's not entirely accidental, and it's not only attributable to academic myopia. There's a certain challenge to vested interests that don't cater to students developing those skills. There's also modern technologies that are beyond any legal and ethical framework of control. Genetic engineering really does not have a framework of legal and ethical controls. I refer you to the Council for Responsible Genetics set up by Harvard and MIT scientists on that score. The new technology of nanotechnology, invisible particles, which will be in all our bodies and everything around us. There isn't even a move in Congress for any kind of legal framework, whether of disclosure or of curtailing potential risks, rather than simply being beguiled by all the supposed benefits. What it really comes down to is controlling corporate coercion. When you have a credit score that is lowered if you make a complaint to an insurance company, and you don't even know how your credit score is arrived at, and you don't even know when you complain that your credit score is going down, that's corporate coercion. When you have to sign fine print contracts, which are about 98% of all the contracts you'll sign, click on now, you don't even have to sign. Fine print, the one-sided vendor contract that decides whether you can go to court or not, and binding arbitration that decides all kinds of things against your advantage, that's corporate coercion. And you can say, well, you don't have to buy insurance, you don't have to buy a car, but if you don't like Allstate as contract, and you go to State Farm, same contract. You don't like Ford's installment loan contract, you go to GM, same contract. So you don't have any competition over contracts of adhesion. We have lost the freedom of contract, and is a scar on the conscience and professional pomposity of law schools in this country, that there isn't a drive at law schools in this country to deal with the destruction of freedom of contract through these so-called contracts of adhesion that are becoming worse and worse to a point where they flaunt you and they put right in print. The vendor has the right to change the terms of the contracts as the vendor sees fit. That's the end of any kind of contract, which is supposed to be a binding agreement consensually arrived at between buyer and seller. Corporate coercion comes in terms of contaminated air and water. As I said earlier, it's hard not to inhale. It comes in terms of buying politicians and turning government against its own people. It comes in terms of the 1872 Mining Act, which allows foreign and domestic corporations to go on our public lands, as a company in Canada did, a gold company in Nevada, and basically get billions of dollars worth of gold, silver, molybdenum, and other hard rock metals for $5 an acre. So the Barrick Corporation got $9 billion worth of our gold for $30,000. And the Mining Congress has obstructed any kind of change. That's a form of coercion, because it doesn't do it on the merits, it does it on the money. Corporate coercion is all around us. It restricts our voter choice because it fosters and supports a two-party tyranny who dial for the same commercial dollars and keep competitive choices on the ballot of third-party and independent candidates at bay, if indeed they can even make the attempt. Market fundamentalism. Beware of market fundamentalism in the guise of conservatism or libertarianism. Beware of corporatists who masquerade as conservatives. Conservatives and libertarians do not like corporate welfare. They want crackdowns on corporate crime. Conservatives and libertarians do not like the restrictions against the protection of privacy, the invasion of privacy. There's a whole host of areas where corporatists have managed to give the impression, successfully and politically, especially in Washington, that conservatives and libertarians are really on their side. But in many, many areas they are not. The Pentagon waste and fraud and corruption is enormous. I don't know any libertarian that really favors that. And if you look at the destructive war on drugs, and what's that dealing in Mexico and on the border and in our country, and the diversion of public resources and the drive-by shootings and all the rest that are going on in our schools in the inner city. And you see that there's a large consensus between people who call themselves liberals, conservatives, and libertarians. So why go into that? It's so much easier to look at the empirical reality and then induce from the empirical reality how your own sense of fairness, your own sense of strategy, your own sense of perspicacity will take these facts and resolve them so that there is a protection of life and limb and a pursuit of happiness. I want to come back to the students here. You have to ask yourself, are you at a high-priced trade school, or are you at a university? Are you largely getting a social life and an occupational skill, and that's the purpose of being here? Or are you developing civic skills by connecting Vanderbilt to the problems in Nashville as your laboratory, just as physics students and chemistry students and biology students have their in-house laboratories? You can have your community as a laboratory. And don't think that consumer skills and taxpayer skills in terms of policy and civic skills are low on the intellectual totem pole, as I sensed was the case at the law school I went to, when I asked a professor, why do we have so many tax courses but we have no courses on food law? And he said, because tax courses deal with a highly intricate form of law that present a deep intellectual challenge. But food law? And he gave a grimace. Think of that for a while. Why is it that Einstein once said, physics is easy compared to politics? These are the great challenges, intellectually and normatively, empirically, operationally. And you should have them as part of your curriculum. Let me end on this note. Beware of phony market fundamentalism, seasoned by corporate crime, spiked by corporate fraud, watered by corporate waste, and when those aren't enough, saved by government taxpayer bailouts and the salvation of the pernicious deregulatory phenomenon that takes law and order away from being applied to the rich and powerful and the government and the corporate. And not only takes it away, but allows defenseless people all over the country to die, to be injured, to be sick, to be defrauded, to be disrespected, to be underpaid, to be overcharged, to be marginalized, without giving them the tools to fight back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nader. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Mr. John Stossel. John Stossel joined Fox Business News in 2009. He currently hosts Stossel, a weekly program highlighting current consumer issues from a libertarian viewpoint. His first shows covered such topics as healthcare, global warming, the novel Atlas Shrugged, and the food police. Stossel also appears regularly on Fox News Channel providing signature analysis. Prior to joining Fox, Stossel co-anchored ABC's award-winning primetime news magazine show, 2020, where he contributed in-depth special projects and recurring segments on a variety of consumer topics, from pop culture to government and business. There, his John Stossel specials ask tough questions about issues facing Americans today. For example, the program entitled Sick in America delved into the debate between private versus government health care. Likewise, Stupid in America exposed the government's education monopoly. The program John Stossel Goes to Washington revealed government growth under both parties, while Hype exposed media distortions. Mr. Stossel has received 19 Emmy Awards and has been honored 5 times for excellence in consumer reporting by the National Press Club. Other honors include the George Polk Award for Outstanding Local Reporting and the George Foster Peabody Award. The Dallas Morning News named him the most consistently thought-provoking television reporter of our time, and the Orlando Sentinel said he has the gift for entertaining while saying something profound. We are honored that he is joining us for this evening's program, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Stossel to the stage.
Thank you. I think Mr. Nader made some good points. I'll discuss both of those in a minute. As I talk, I'd just like you to think about one concept. There are only 2 ways to do things in life: voluntary or forced. So I was a big admirer of Ralph Nader, and I began my career because of him. I was one of the first TV consumer reporters, and I viewed the world at the time, I think much as he did, that capitalism is okay, brings us some stuff, but by and large it's cruel and unfair, and that's why you need government to protect us from the evil capitalists, from their greed. And I could do those stories about how the merchant class has too much power night after night. I won those 19 Emmys doing that. And there were infinite stories I could do. The Coffee Association was running ads that said, coffee's the drink that picks you up while it calms you down. So we called him up and said, how can you say this? It's contradictory. Well, we have research to back this up. Really? What's the research? Well, we surveyed thousands of people. We asked them, when do you get out of your coffee break? Some people said it picked them up. Some people said it calmed them down. Libby Owens Ford Glass Company was running ads saying, look how clear our car window glass is. And they shot them with the windows rolled down. So this is why we consumer activists said, Nader's right, you got to have regulation. You have to police these capitalists. And Ralph single-handedly, remarkably, what a dedicated person. He himself probably created 8 major federal consumer protection laws. And in theory, intuitively, this makes sense. There's cheating, we got to police it. But then I stayed on the beat and I watched those regulators work. And now I have to say, they don't make life better for consumers, they make it worse. First of all, they consume vast amounts of money. The least of it is the direct cost, the money we pay in taxes to pay them. The bigger cost is the indirect cost. All the money and creative energy that's now spent just trying to understand the rules and game the system. Some of the best students here are going not into science or engineering or medicine, you're going to law school. Why? Because that's where the action is. And we need some lawyers, but by and large, they don't make America more prosperous. They don't invent things. They don't create. Companies increasingly use their best people, just try to understand the rules and get around them. All the energy that's lost trying to lobby now the politicians and the giant regulatory agencies that Ralph created, all the time you spent filling out the forms. Does it make you safer? I don't think so. But it strangles economic growth, and that makes people safer. What finally started to convince me that I was on the wrong track as a consumer reporter is that I soon saw that all these regulations didn't even work on the obvious crooks. The people selling the breast enlargers and the burn fat while you sleep pills, they kept getting away with it. They're still getting away with it. Maybe 5 years into the scam, the sleepy regulators would go after them, and then the crook would hire a defense lawyer and use our incredibly slow legal system to hold them off another 5 years, and then they would just change the name of the product or move to a different state or sign a consent order. That's where they say, we don't admit doing anything wrong, but we won't do it anymore. By contrast, the more I watched the market competition work, and Ralph touched on that, I saw it protects us better. There are a million ways it happens. When the cheaters cheat, maybe better business bureaus get involved, or the companies get bad PR, other companies sue them. But most importantly, the word gets out. If you want to get really rich in a free society, the way to do it is not to cheat your customers. The way to do it is to please your customers, to serve them well. Bill Gates got rich by giving us something new that we didn't know we wanted. You don't get rich by cheating people. When I got to, I could find scams to do night after night as a local reporter. But when I got to the national stage, to Good Morning America in 2020, they were tougher to find. Why? Because they didn't grow to a national scale. Word got out. The good companies thrive, the bad ones atrophy because of competition. It's not a perfect system. There will always be cheaters. There'll be some Enrons and Bernie Madoffs. But what's remarkable in a $14 trillion economy is how rare they are. They're on the front pages because they're the exception. For the most part, market competition works, despite what the politicians and Ralph say. Look even at the greedy, profit-driven companies that have employed me. I've worked now for the 3 big TV networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. All get all their money, every penny of profit, from the advertisers. So intuitively, you would think they wouldn't allow consumer reporting. They wouldn't pay me to bite the hand that fed them. And yet they did. I did stories for these networks that earned us $25 million lawsuits from Bristol Myers because I said they were lying in their advertising for Excedrin and Bufferin. And yet CBS said, go ahead, Stossel, keep doing it. Why? When consumer reporting was beginning on TV, Ralph Nader said you would never see it on commercial television stations. You'd only see it on public TV. And that's logical. It's logical to think that the stations wouldn't want to offend the people who pay them, but government TV would do consumer reporting. But what's the truth now, 30 years later? The opposite is true, which is the case with a lot of what Ralph says. Sorry, that was a smart aleck from me. I apologize, Ralph. Oh, we'll get to that later. There is almost no consumer reporting on public TV because the timid bureaucrats are too nervous about offending anybody. But most commercial TV stations have consumer reporters. Why? Because the market works in unexpected ways. In this case, yes, I would tick off some sponsors. Sometimes a car dealer would pull his advertising from the station. But more of you wanted to watch a news program that told the truth about sponsors' products too. So with More people watching, the stations made more money. They hired consumer reporters. The market works better than government. But wait a second, how can I defend that kind of capitalism? As Heather said in introducing us, look at the economic crisis we're in now. But Heather, where are you, Heather? I mean, how can you say it's a crisis? We're too quick to use this word crisis. Why is today a financial crisis? Unemployment's high, it's almost 10%. But what was it in 1982? Do you even remember? It reached 10.8%. I wager most of you don't remember that. I mean, a crisis is the soldiers freezing during the Revolutionary War when the British were coming, or the bubonic plague, or the Depression. Those were crises. We're too quick to use the word. Yes, the stock market fell 25%, but so what? We have booms and busts. Anybody here, the Dow is now about 11,000. Anybody here remember what the Dow was in 1982? Anybody want to guess? 4,000, somebody says. Somebody got it here, 780. So in 25 years, it's gone from 780 to 11,000. Had that happened steadily without going to 14,000 first and dropping, we'd say this is one of the greatest boom periods we've ever had. But we're such wimps that we consider a contraction to be a crisis. Bubbles pop. Capitalism created the wealth that was diminished. But the media is always screaming crisis. Global warming is a crisis. Y2K was the crisis before that. Remember it? All the computers were going to crash in the year 2000. The planes were going to go down. Bird flu, swine flu were going to kill everybody. Mad cow disease. How about the pesticide residues? That's one of Ralph Nader's. He's created many organizations like the PERG organizations. They're very upset about those chemicals in the food. And we were told the pesticide residues were causing the cancer epidemic. Well, if all these things are killing people, where are the bodies? We're living longer than ever. There is no cancer epidemic. Cancer rates are flat or going down. We just live long enough to get cancer. But they were saying, oh, that frog testicles are shrinking. These chemicals are going to make us all sterile. Then the press moved on to the next scare. Now it's the plastic in bottles. They moved on also to the killer bees. Remember, they were going to come up from Washington and from Mexico and sting us to death. The specialists closest to the problem are the ones who get most panicked. And in the case of the current so-called crisis, who was that? It was Hank Paulson under Bush and Tim Geithner under Obama. And it's not surprising they panicked. All their friends were calling them up from Goldman Sachs. Oh my God, we're losing all this money. You have to do something. And I'm in agreement with Mr. Nader on this. It was outrageous that we bailed them out, but they felt they had to act. This is corporate socialism. He's right. This is state capitalism. Capitalism means you get to succeed or fail. That's what makes it worse. Now, they said, well, we have to intervene here. There was a credit freeze. And they were worried because Bernanke did his thesis on the Depression, and there was a credit freeze. When the banks had runs, nobody was lending, things shut down. But that was then. Now we have the internet. Are you telling me that if you invented the wheel and you just needed someone to fund you so you could make a whole lot of them and get rich, that somebody wouldn't find a way to get you the money, even if all the banks were out of business? They would. Maybe it'd be PayPal. I don't know. You would invent something. What if the government had cut Fannie and Freddie and Bear and the others loose to let them do what other businesses do when they hit hard times? Renegotiate with their creditors, revalue their assets. Without a bailout, the market wouldn't have resumed, wouldn't have sorted it out, prices wouldn't have found a more solid floor. We'll never know because they didn't let it happen, because they were so scared. And people being scared is part of what built Ralph Nader's successful career. He made people scared about car safety, and a lot of that was good. But I built my career about that and stopped winning Emmys when I started wising up to the folly of not putting our fears in perspective. My first TV special, I interviewed Ralph, and Afterward, he called me the most dishonest reporter he'd ever met. He didn't like what I had done. I made fun of him for saying, we should worry about everything. And he said, chicken contaminated with pesticides, sometimes with rat feces. We shouldn't eat hot dogs, high fat content. Carpets are dangerous. Rugs are dirt collectors. Indoor air pollution. Coffee is not good for you. And he has a right to complain. I did edit him down, and that's what I do in television. But I was trying to make a point that consumer activists and we consumer reporters were scaring people about everything. And that's not useful. We ought to put it in perspective and tell you what to worry about and what to worry about less. And ABC have finally agreed to give me a show about that where we rank the risks, and I did that. We called it, Are We Scaring You to Death? I wanted to call it, We Are Scaring You to Death, but they wouldn't let me do that. And in this show, we rank the risks. And let's look at some of these comparisons now. The way the risks, whoops, that was supposed to hit the first slide. There we go. The way the risk specialists compare risks is you really shouldn't compare how many people are killed, because something that kills people my age is less socially tragic than something that kills younger people. So the way they do it is, how many days does an average risk take, how many days does a risk take off an average life? And on the top of the chart, plane crashes. Clearly, if the plane crashes, that's news. We got to cover that. But fewer than 200 deaths per year over the past 20 years. I mean, airline crashes are very rare. Less than 1 day off an average life. Terrorism, which we are spending billions on and taking away some of our freedoms because we're worried about being killed by terrorists, even if September 11th happened every 3 years, and it's been more than 7 now. Less than 4 days off an average life. Compare that to ordinary house fires, 5,000 deaths a year. A $10 smoke detector is a wonderful thing. And murder, which leads the news, about 25,000 deaths a year. If these were all the risks, you could say the press wasn't doing that bad a job. But watch how these bars have to shrink when I add driving to the list. This is after Ralph's improvements with seat belts, about 45,000 deaths a year. I mean, this should make us rethink our plane crash coverage. And Ralph helped create the Aviation Consumer Action Project that wants to make it illegal for someone to hold a baby in a flight and wants greater safety regulations. I consider that statistical murder, because when you make flying more expensive, more people drive to grandma's house for Thanksgiving, and that kills people. Should also make you wonder about the person driving farther to get to the organic food store. If these were the risks, you could say we weren't doing that bad a job. But watch how these shrink to make room for cigarette smoking. I mean, the smoker worrying about getting brain cancer from his cell phone is just nuts. And yet we do lots of stories on that. And yet all these bars have to shrink for the last one, which I think is the most relevant and interesting one. And it says poverty. It probably should say low income. Studies have shown that if you're in the lowest quintile of income in other countries, and if you're below the poverty line in the United States, your life is 7 to 10 years shorter. Now, some of it's because poor people sometimes take more risks and they smoke and drink more, but most of it is because poor people can't afford some of the good stuff that keeps us alive. They drive older cars with older tires. They may not afford fresh fruits and vegetables. Wealthier is healthier. In Bangladesh, you have a flood that kills thousands of people. In America, we have floods just as bad. And with the single exception of Katrina, nobody dies because we have wealth. We have cars so we can drive away, radios to hear about the flood, dikes to divert the water. Wealthier is healthier. So what it took me too long in consumer reporting to see until I finally woke up and saw, oh my God, all this regulation I've been cheering on, all of Ralph Nader's parasitic lawyer friends suing right and left, passing tedious regulations. They don't make us safer because they make America a little poorer. If it takes longer to open a new factory because of the OSHA regulations, or if the factory doesn't expand because of OSHA regulations. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which Ralph helped get passed, all well-intended rules. But if that means it takes longer for the new school building to open, money can't flow to its best use. It makes Tennessee a little poorer. That kills people. The headline should be, new OSHA rule to save 4, kill 10. But you don't see that because reporters don't think that way. I mean, let's just talk about OSHA for a moment. Ralph helped create it. Charles Jeffries, who ran it under President Clinton, was fond of holding up a chart showing how workplace accidents and injuries had dropped steadily since OSHA was created. And it was true. And that's a wonderful thing. But then some researchers did a chart of what happened before OSHA. Here it is. Here it is. The slope of the line is exactly the same. Government is like someone who jumps in front of a parade and claims to be leading the parade. In a free society where you allow capitalism, things get better. They get better on their own without government regulation. Selfish businessmen improve things. They don't want to kill their workers, if only because they don't want to spend their money to train new ones. Unions organize to protect the workers. We get better technology that makes things safer. Richer workers start caring more about safety. Left on our own, things get better. But this is not intuitive. It's a complex world. It's intuitive for me to say, boy, I'm glad we have wise elites in Washington, D.C. and state capitals to make sure everything is safe. Life is complex. Take a car. I don't understand what makes one car safer than another or run better than another. I'm no engineer, and Ralph suggested you'd have to have X-ray vision to understand all the risks, and it's true. And yet, compare the worst car you can buy here in Nashville with the best a government could produce. And that's this car. Remember it? This is the Trabant, the pride of East Germany, the pride of the Eastern Bloc. It was such a bad car, you had to put the oil and gas in separately and shake the car to mix them together. And yet this was done by the East German engineers. These guys are rocket scientists. Yet this and the Yugo was the best a government could produce. And when the Berlin Wall went down, the Trabant disappeared, as did the Yugo. So why? Why, since we're not car experts, why could their best not compete with our mediocre product? Because not everybody has to be an expert for the free market to work its magic. You just need a few car buffs, a few people who read the car magazines. And through word of mouth, the good news and the bad news spread. The good companies thrive, the bad ones atrophy. Freedom will protect even the ignorant in a free society. Why are we prosperous? Why are we living longer lives than anybody in the history of the world? Why is America successful when other countries weren't? I ask high school kids that, and they say, well, it's because we're a democracy and because we're a new country, so we have lots of natural resources. So I say, well, India's a democracy. India has lots of natural resources, but they've been poor. Well, they're overpopulated, people say. But actually, the population density of India is the same as that of New Jersey. New Jersey's doing okay. Okay, not that well, but. Holland has many more people. Holland's doing really well. Or how about Hong Kong? Hong Kong has 20 times as many people per square mile as India, and Hong Kong has no natural resources and no democracy. They had the British rulers and now the communist Chinese. And no natural resources, it's just a rock. And yet Hong Kong, in 50 years, went from third world to first world. Why? Because they had economic freedom. The British rulers enforced rule of law. That's important. They kept people from killing each other or stealing each other's stuff. Enforced some pollution rules. I agree with Ralph. That's a role for government. But then they left free people alone. They sat around and drank tea. Benign neglect allowed free people in Hong Kong to become as rich as we are through economic freedom. But that's business, and people don't like business. I stopped winning Emmys when I wised up. Why? Because my fellow reporters hate business. They hate capitalism. They view it as evil. And I'm trying to figure out, what's that about? What's this hatred of markets about? And at first I thought it was envy, because your college professor is envious of his slightly stupider roommate who's now in business making much more money than he is. But then I thought about old Europe, and I thought envy can't be it, because look at the income disparity there. The kings and queens were vastly richer than the peasants, but the peasants didn't hate them. They revered them. But they hated the bourgeoisie. They gave them that nasty name. They hated the very people who produced the things that made their lives better. So what's that about? I'm trying to understand that, and I've come to think it's because most people think of business, of life, as a zero-sum game. And I understand why politicians think that way and lawyers think that way, because their lives do work that way. If one person wins, somebody else loses. But business doesn't work that way. It's not like there's this pie, and if Bill Gates takes a big chunk, we have less. No, Gates got rich by baking thousands of new pies. He creates wealth. Business doesn't happen unless it creates wealth, unless both parties think they win, unless they're tricked, because business is voluntary. That's the key. There are only two ways to do things: coerced or voluntary. And voluntary is better. And business, all of it, is voluntary. Ralph can talk about business coercion, but it's really the exception. The transaction happens only if both parties think they win. It's why you get the weird double thank you moment when you buy anything. I buy a cup of coffee. She gives me the coffee. I give her the buck. We say, thank you, thank you. Why the double thank you? Because I wanted the coffee more than I wanted the buck. She wanted the buck more than she wanted the coffee. It doesn't happen unless you both win, because business is voluntary. We have created a growing government. It's now up to 40% of the economy. And government is force. We need some force, but we need limited government. That's why I disagree with Ralph, who wants to grow these regulatory agencies. I'll close just by saying capitalism has lifted more people out of the mud and misery of stoop labor than any system ever, and yet it is vilified in most universities around America and in every newsroom I've ever worked in. I am a market fundamentalist. Ralph used that term. George Soros called me that once. I proudly will say I am a market fundamentalist. I have discovered that markets do almost everything better. But we don't notice it because we take its miracles for granted. We just take it for granted that we can have a supermarket down the street and it's open all the time. It carries 30,000 products. And they rarely poison you. Not because of Ralph Nader's food safety laws, but because the reputations of those brand names know that they better police their food or they'll go out of business. We take it for granted that I can go to a foreign country and stick a piece of plastic in the wall and cash will come out. And I could take the same piece of plastic and give it to a total stranger and he'll rent me a car for a week. And when I get home, Visa or MasterCard will have the accounting correct to the penny. Just accept it. I don't even think about it. But government can't even count the votes accurately. And now government's going to run health care? And Ralph wants it to regulate business? I hope not. I hope you fight for the freedom that made America possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. We are fortunate to have some time for question and answers. There are microphone stands in the back of the auditorium if you'd like to ask a question to either or both of the speakers. I told the Student Speakers Committee that I would give them the benefit of asking the first question, and because they've worked so hard on the event, I think they get that right. So while we're having our speakers answer that question, if you'd like to ask one, you can line up. We are going to ask people who ask questions to identify whether the question is for one or both of the speakers, and to also please, mindful of time considerations, limit yourself to one question and no follow-ups. The Student Speakers Committee would like to ask you directly something you both already touched on. Who benefits more from the new health care legislation, businesses or consumers? What further reforms does our health care system need immediately?
Who first?
Mr. Nader, would you like to speak first since you were...
Well, in the 2,600-page bill, which doesn't go into effect in terms of most of its coverage expansion of people until 2014, the health insurance companies and drug companies got pretty much what they wanted. E.J. Dionne, columnist for the Washington Post, stated the other day that the Democrats passed the early Republican version, and Ben Stein, who was a speechwriter for Nixon, said that Nixon's proposal in the 70s, or in the 60s, 70s, I guess, was better than Obama's. So, A, it doesn't have a public option or a public choice for people, so that doesn't enhance competition and temper the price of the policies of Aetna and Cigna. B, it doesn't safeguard the right of the states to experiment their efforts in Pennsylvania and California to move to a single-payer, full Medicare type freedom of choice of doctor and hospital model. And it doesn't give any power to any consumers. It doesn't engage in a power shift. So I think overall that there will be more coverage starting in 2014, but the lawyers for the health insurance companies are going to be able to game the system and design around a lot of the positive features. So we favor full Medicare for all, which gives you freedom of choice for doctor and hospital, which most people in HMOs today do not have, and which eliminates a lot of administrative expenses. Aetna's administrative expenses, a premium dollars between 25 and 30 cents out of the dollar, and Medicare's administrative expenses about 3 cents. So there are a lot of advantages to the full Medicare for all, and it'll have better outcomes. The idea of health insurance companies making more money by denying claims and restricting benefits and excluding people is a perverse incentive. It's really not a market incentive. Most companies want to make more. They want more customers. Car companies, cosmetic companies, so on. But in this case, and that's why all Western countries have eliminated private health insurance companies. They have some nonprofit or a single-payer Medicare type system. And this system will continue. The prices will go up, and it becomes more complex. There'll still be 24 million people not covered. Many will be inadequately covered, and the entrenchment in Washington by these corporate lobbyists will be even greater than it has been. So it's not very good news. I might say that the Canadian health care bill, everybody in, nobody out, when it was enacted by Parliament in Ottawa, was 13 pages compared to 2,600 pages.
Well, I certainly would agree that it's a lousy bill and it's going to make things cost more. I disagree that full Medicare for all or the Canadian system is good. I think that would look like the Trabant over time. All the innovation that makes healthcare better comes from our somewhat private system. But yes, this is just more money for insurance, and insurance is the worst part of capitalism because when somebody else pays, you don't care what things cost. Look at the tiny piece of healthcare where there is a free market. That's LASIK eye surgery or plastic surgery. The tiny piece where customers pay themselves. What's going on? Prices are coming down, quality's going up. Doctors give out their cell phone numbers and their email address because they want to suck up to the customers. That's a market. Insurance destroys the market, and Obamacare just gave more people insurance, and I agree with Mr. Nader, it's a gift to big insurance companies.
We'll start with a question from this side.
So this is a question for Mr. Nader specifically. You mentioned the lack of effective stockholder control over the companies that they own, and also the lack of effective consumer group control over the government. Given the technical complexity of what a modern corporation does, and also the complexity of the issues that face the government, do you really think it's feasible to have what are essentially a bunch of amateurs running the show, or should we have experts, proxies in their place?
There wouldn't be amateurs. After all, institutional shareholders can hire a lot of good experts like mutual funds and pension funds, trillions of dollars. They own a large portion of the shares of these large corporations on the New York Stock Exchange. So they would have that kind of expertise. That's one. As far as consumers go, we've proposed facilities, since the government bails out these corporate crooks with trillions of dollars of your money and subsidizes them in corporate welfare. Why not a fraction of 1% to facilitate people organizing their own groups as nonprofit, non-governmental groups with experts vis-a-vis insurance companies, banks, brokerage houses, landlords, you name it. There is such a model in Illinois and San Diego on utilities, and it works pretty well. People decide, there's an insert in the motor vehicle registration messages from the state of Illinois, and people can join the Illinois Citizen Utility Board, and they have their own experts, and they got a $1.3 billion refund without litigation in 1993 from Commonwealth Edison because they caught them red-handed overcharging them for excess capacity in their electric plants. So you're right, there does have to be an intermediary institution with daily experts, daily specialists who can take on their counterparts for the corporation. But when it comes to voters, though, remember, government used to have paper ballots, and Canada has paper ballots. By 11 o'clock at night, they know who won, who lost. When we went to these complex systems, because the vendors persuaded politicians in the procurement game to take away the paper ballot and put it in all these complex systems, the government did not own the proprietary software. And to this day, two companies own the proprietary software that deals with this complexity, which screws up the counting of the votes, and those two companies just merged.
Mr. Stossel, do you have anything in response to the question or the response? All right. Question from this side.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Nader. You spoke a lot about the social corporatism and the like, and I just had a question. You kind of took it from the perspective that the government can step in and regulate, but you also mentioned and alluded to the revolving door between big corporations and government, and I'm just wondering about government coercion and what your thoughts are on that.
Good question.
Yeah, well, obviously government coercion. The always question is, how much is government, how much is the corporate control of government? Let's say we get into wars overseas. Some of it is ideologically driven by people in government, like Bush, messianic militarist that he was. But others is driven by the huge markets, oil companies, and the huge contracts that come when we're in these adventures overseas. So there's always an amalgam. The question is, how do we get government to represent more people in this country and less giant corporations? And that's our job. It's not going to be given to us. It's the extent to which we spend time on our four critical roles as workers, consumers, taxpayers, and voters. And how much time do we spend on our roles? If your neighbor spent 22% of your income and could send your children off to war and increase or reduce your taxes or let nearby companies toxify you, would you spend any time overlooking your neighbor? Of course you would. That's your Congress.
But that's the point, that because government has become so big, of course the corporations are going to try to lobby it, to manipulate it. If you shrink government, you don't have all this lobbying going on.
But you don't have the consumer, you don't have the citizen power. Let's say we want to shrink government. Let's say we want to shrink the bloated, corrupt, wasteful Pentagon budget and the corporate welfare budget. We still cannot escape the responsibilities of putting time in and organizing ourselves as workers, consumers, taxpayers, and voters, John. There's no escape from that, whether it's up or down.
But the best organizing is that consumers vote with their dollars when they say, I want this product because it serves me well.
But what if they don't know that the product is deceptive and harmful, as in your early career before you became a convert you used to expose regularly?
Word gets out.
All right, we're going to move to the next question.
I could cite Stossel against Stossel, but I'm not that cruel.
Do we have a question from this side of the hall?
Hi, my question is to Mr. Stossel. You mentioned you keep saying a lot that the market is works best, but if any Vanderbilt student who's taken an economics course with Professor Buckles here will tell you is that the market works and it also fails, as you can see with today's economic issues. So I guess my question, I agree with you. I agree that competition is a competitive market works. You can look at any like Vegas Strip and see that it does. But how do you increase competition? How do you tell someone to compete against someone like Bill Gates, who you mentioned, who owns basically a monopoly in what he does?
Well, monopoly is a problem. If a monopoly usually happens because someone colludes with government, because government is the only organization that can use force to keep competitors out. But I was told when I was graduating from college, IBM was a monopoly, and the Justice Department spent 9 years enriching lawyers to try to break up that monopoly. And little computer companies came up and cleaned their clocks. If Microsoft gets fat and lazy and doesn't serve consumers well, he can't keep a competitor from beating him. He doesn't control the market. The market isn't perfect, but the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Well, I mean, that's a cop-out, John. You know that. I mean, let's talk a little bit more specifically. Wall Street was not regulated, and it collapsed, and it took $13 trillion of value out of the people's wealth.
It created that $13 trillion.
You mean like derivatives? Yeah, that really feeds people.
No,
the other thing is...
The market went up to 14,000.
The credit cards weren't regulated, and how many people here haven't been ripped off by overcharges and small print and fine this and penalty that? How about this one? You want to talk about corporate coercion? Let's see where you come down on this, John. What's this? Is there a sales tax here? Yes. What is it? Huh? 9.25% sales tax, and probably on some necessities, not just wants and whims, right? Okay, like furniture. In Alabama, they tax food. I mean, these are necessities, clothing, etc. Now, $600 trillion of derivatives traded on Wall Street in 2008, and there wasn't a single penny of sales tax. So how come if you buy furniture here in Tennessee, you pay 9% sales tax, and tomorrow somebody buys $100 million worth of Exxon derivatives and doesn't pay a penny? That's corporate coercion.
But that's just silly. I mean, maybe they are clever at lobbying, but if you tax the derivatives, people would just trade them in London or Hong Kong, and all that tax money will leave America anyway. Probably you shouldn't have to pay the 9% sales tax on furniture. If we shrink government to the size it should be, you wouldn't have to.
Actually, England does have a tax on derivatives. Abraham Lincoln had one. FDR had one. And it's such a delightful tax because it's a tax on speculation, not investment, that you could get an international treaty quite quickly because all these countries would like that kind of revenue that does not harm regular people who are trying to deal with the real economy, not the paper speculative economy.
All right, we have time for one more question from this side of the room.
Why just one more?
Because I do what they tell me to do. I have been asked to inform you all that both of our speakers will be available for continued discussion and book signing in the lobby after the evening. So they will be available for conversation.
It's not the same.
Do you want to keep it? I take my orders from the speaker. All right. We suddenly have time for more questions. Let's continue.
Well, thank you both for coming. My question is for Mr. Nader, but I would like you both to comment. Mr. Nader, there seems to be somewhat of a contradiction in your argument in that you champion consumer choice, and yet you're against big business. But didn't big business get that way because of consumer choice? Because a small business was able to compete, be very competitive, and the consumers chose it and made it a big business and made it wealthy. So I'd just like you to respond to that.
Well, in the electronic consumer area, you're right. But in some other areas, they got it through collusion, through monopolistic practices, predatory practices against small business. Look at the history of Standard Oil.
Could you cite an example?
Look at the history of Standard Oil, starting with John D. Rockefeller. Well chronicled how Standard Oil crushed the opposition. That's why the antitrust laws were established. The other thing is, the bigger you get, the more you're guaranteed by your corporate government in Washington, whereas a small bank isn't guaranteed. A big bank is too big to fail, so if you want to put your savings in a secure place, would you go to the small bank that is rickety because it doesn't have a federal guarantee, or would you go to a big bank that has a federal guarantee? So there are a lot of reasons. Some companies grow big. Interface Corporation has grown large in Atlanta, the leading carpet tile manufacturer, because it really represents what John hopes for but often doesn't get, which is a superior product based on sustainability principles. Ray Anderson, who heads it, has a goal of 2020 where there will be zero pollution and 100% recycling of his product. And he's done it by reducing costs and making more profit. The question is why the big guys don't do that. Maybe it's because they don't have to. But if we had more powerful consumer groups to drive that kind of quality, it would be good. I have to correct John, because he put it in his book, which has a lot of errors in it. I have been credited with being a major force in television consumer journalism by going to television stations around the country years and years ago and encouraging them to develop a slot. And I would say to them, good heavens, this is stuff people are interested in. But a lot of consumer reporters were fired because they were too good. Herb Denenberg, for example, Roberta Baskin, the former in Philadelphia, the latter in Chicago. And there's been a decline in recent years of tough-minded consumer journalists on television. I mean, the late television news has really become degraded beyond belief. And as far as public TV, they get a lot of donations from these corporations, and they are a bit frightful, although Frontline does some very good stuff. Frontline does some really excellent stuff out of Boston, WGBH. I just wanted to correct one, just to give you an example of what I could really do to that book he wrote.
Well, it's true, those people have lost their jobs, but that's two people. I had Steve Wilson, too, but he was a lunatic. They are the exception that proves the rule. And the Standard Oil...
Exception never proves the rule. It defeats the rule. You should have learned that in your Princeton course on logic with John Kemeny.
Fair enough.
And Steve Wilson is a very good reporter. He is tough as nails, and I don't like him to be slandered here.
Yeah, I'm doing it playfully. We used to share an office. The Standard Oil monopoly, that's Rockefeller, right? Rockefeller is vilified as this robber baron I'm sure you learn about the robber barons in your history courses. But think of Rockefeller made kerosene so cheap that he became what they call the monopoly because he did it better. He found a way to get fuel to people so much more efficiently that for the first time, poor and middle-class people could stay up at night and read. Rockefeller probably saved the whales because he made kerosene cheaper than whale oil, and people stopped killing whales. Did you read that in school? Rockefeller saved the whales? I doubt that.
It's amazing the way these robber barons take advantage of inventors whose names you'll never know. Rockefeller was a marketeer. Some people consider him a racketeer. What he did to twist the railroads so they wouldn't take the products of his competitors. I mean, the textbook on predatory activity was written by the Standard Oil Trust in those days. You know, a lot of these corporations, they take advantage of things they never invested in and produced. It was trillions of dollars of government research and development that expanded the aerospace industry, built the biotech industry, got the nanotech industry underway, established the semiconductor industry. Over 3/4 of the drugs against cancer came out of the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And of course, the taxpayer never gets any credit for this. Government never gets any credit for this. A lot of the new industries wouldn't even be where they were because if it wasn't for government investment. The other year, the head of Intel, one of the most profitable companies in the world, Andy Grove, goes to Washington, a Senate committee, demanding more tax credits, demanding more welfare. Cisco's on welfare. Intel's on welfare. Microsoft's on welfare. Not only do they get the R&D, they get all kinds of tax credits. This is just like a check from the Treasury. I know a lot of small businesses don't get tax credits.
Well, we agree. None of them should get corporate welfare. But we have the cancer drugs not because the NIH invented them, but because these drug companies did 99% of the research to get them to market. And I'm really glad they did.
That's a marketing aspect. And the point is that you take the drug Taxol. It was developed with $31 million of taxpayer money by the National Cancer Institute. And under the CRADA agreements, which is known as technology transfer, they gave a monopoly marketing right to Bristol-Myers Squibb to market Taxol without any reasonable price provisions, without any royalties back to the government. And so a woman who had ovarian cancer wrote me in 2000. She lost her $19,000 a year job, lost her insurance. She had ovarian cancer, serious, went to her doctor. Doctor says, the only thing that's left is Taxol. She said, how much? She says, $14,000 for 6 treatments. That was discovered and clinically tested by your representatives at the National Institutes of Health. That story isn't known either.
But
that's what I mean about reality.
You said 31 million NIH spent, but to get a new drug approved costs 500 million. So I don't like Bristol Myers. They're the people who sued me for $23 million. But they're the ones who put up the hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure the drug is safe and effective and to get it to us.
That is a phony argument. That it's now up to 800 million. They'll create it out of thin air. Look at Jamie Love's analysis of that and you'll see, John. Don't ever use that figure. That's a phony figure. A completely phony figure. The government in the Pentagon has developed new drugs like anti-hepatitis drugs, anti-malarial drugs, between $5 and $10 million plus their salaries of the MDs and the PhDs who are brigadier generals and colonels at Walter Reed and Bethesda hospitals.
All right, Mr. Stossel, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to take another question.
Go right to the question.
All right.
As a young person who is hopefully going to be around for quite a few years to come, my question to both speakers is, what do you propose that we do about our ever-increasing deficit?
Mr. Stossel, would you like to begin since you waived your right to close the last one?
I agree that this is a terrifying problem. I mean, we're increasing the size of government at terrifying speeds. Medicare alone, which Ralph praises, and it's been a wonderful plan, is a Ponzi scheme. We locked Bernie Madoff up for running just this kind of Ponzi scheme. He took money from people. He said, we're investing for your future. He spent it himself. Well, Congress took the money when they passed Social Security and Medicare and said it's for our retirement, but they spent it right away on war and corporate welfare and all the things Congress spends on. And that worked for a while when there were lots of us young people to pay for the few retirees, and when Social Security was passed, most people didn't even live to the age of 65. But now we're rude enough to live to the age of, on average, 78. And we keep wanting new, good, cool things that these drug companies produce to make our lives more comfortable. And there aren't enough of you young people to pay for us baby boomers. This is just going to blow up. And on top of it, Obama has added a new entitlement, and Congress spends more on everything. They even gave me government insurance on a beach house I built because they said, oh, people who build on the edges of oceans, they need government health insurance because private insurers won't cover them. Well, maybe there's a reason they don't cover us. They spend and spend. This is a big threat to your generation. All you can do is speak up and say, we believe in limited government. That build the country. We should repeal 2 rules for every new one you pass.
Mr. Nader?
First of all, both parties are spending beyond their means. Second of all, I would never call Medicare a Ponzi scheme. Tell millions of elderly Americans who wouldn't have been able to afford health care that it's a Ponzi scheme. It is being ripped off by commercial medicine, and that's well known. You've seen that on 60 Minutes, 2020, and so forth. There's a lot of commercial crime against Medicare, phony billing, phantom charges, et cetera, and the government has been very weak in cracking down on that. But here's what I suggest we do about the deficit. Number one, half of the U.S. government's operating expenditures is the military. We got to cut down on that. There are a lot of generals and admirals retired who will show that it's absurd. We have, like an $800 billion military budget, and there's no more Soviet Union. And China is too busy converting communist criminal capitalism into criminal communism to criminal capitalism. They're not going to send missiles over here. So we're desperately searching for enemies, right, to keep this giant military-industrial complex. Cut out corporate welfare. The Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, right-wing groups have pointed out hundreds of billions of dollars of corporate welfare. That's second. Third, change our tax system. So we first tax, before we tax labor, we tax that which we like the least or dislike the most as a society. And that means you tax addictive products, you tax speculative derivatives, you tax gambling, you tax corporate crime before that. And the nice thing about derivatives is I would like to see one rule that says, speculate all you want, you guys. Go to the sky. But don't do it with other people's money. Do it with your money. And get your derivatives up to 800 trillion. 1 billion trillion, 2 billion trillion, and we're going to tax it. And we're going to get revenues of hundreds of billions of dollars a year to tax it. John Maynard Keynes recommended it. There are conservative economists who've recommended it. Tax first what we like the least or dislike the most. And if they want to expand it, let them expand it. But that's one way to reduce the deficit, to make them pay for their own bailouts if they do it again, without putting added taxes on the shoulders of working Americans. And over time, you will bring that deficit under control.
Mr. Stossel, would you like to respond to any of Mr. Nader's comments?
This to me sounds like faith-based regulation. The idea that you'll have the perfect regulator, let's say Hillary is the regulator-in-chief, and she knows which instruments are dangerous and which derivatives are the problem, is folly, because soon there'll be the Credit Default Swap Trade Association that will lobby Congress and get a special exemption for them, and they won't be regulated. And some new product will emerge, which will be the real problem. small flat tax is far better, and the way to cut deficits is to cut the spending. The spending has grown faster than inflation forever, under both parties. Ralph is correct.
I am going to have the bad role of saying this is, in fact, our last question. So please make it a good one.
Pressure.
No pressure at all. My question is straightforward, so I'd like a terse answer, and it's intended for both speakers. I believe it was Oprah's Christmas special that the president graded himself, and I suspect there was some grade inflation when he gave himself a solid B+. If we could start, whichever speaker wants to go first, give Obama a grade, a proper one.
I give him an A+ for communication and being charming, and an F for expanding government faster than anybody.
Mr. Nader?
Well, I think he had an easy act to follow. I think he's been too concessionary to big business, to Wall Street, to the health insurance and drug giants, and hasn't allowed people he's known for years back in Chicago who favor single payer, who favor consumer protection, even to visit him in the White House. He's had 6 visits with the head of Aetna, 5 with the head of Pfizer, 0 with Dr. Quentin Young, the dean of humane medicine, former head of a section of Cook County Hospital, an old friend of Barack. He never invited
And
him to the White House.
20 from the head of the Government Workers Union.
And what?
And even more visits from the head of the Government Workers Union.
Well, SEIU, you mean? Yeah.
Yes.
And he's been too belligerent abroad. There's a remarkable similarity in military and foreign policy between Bush's second term and Barack Obama. And a lot of people have said that on all sides of the political aisle. And the expansion of the brutal war in Afghanistan, which is a boomerang proposition, is just one example. The lack of cutting spending in the Pentagon on huge weapon systems designed for the Soviet Union era of hostility that retired generals and admirals have condemned. He hasn't done that.
Continuing to wage the war on drugs.
Yes, this is where we both agree. I mean, you talk about a boomeranging situation that's corrupting everything it touches, destroying so many innocent lives in our cities and borders elsewhere. But what I really fault him of is he doesn't define freedom the way Marcus Cicero defines freedom for the American people. He defined it, and I'll end with this. Over 2,000 years ago, Cicero defined freedom this way. Freedom is participation in power. That's a good definition of democracy. Thank you.
I think you'll join me in thanking both of our speakers not only for a lively and interesting discussion, but also for demonstrating the spirit and practice of civil disagreement in a time that we find that a rare commodity. So thank you very much.